Okay, welcome back to the Introductory Psych Rathus text. In this video, we're going to be covering or beginning chapter number 7, which is kind of a mishmash of a few different topics that are all sort of related to the overall topic of cognitive psychology, or this branch of psychology that studies thinking, all the things that go on between our ears. So in this chapter, we're going to cover some stuff about thinking, about cognition, sort of broadly speaking, kind of how humans think. Then we'll talk about the use of language, and then we'll look at some theories of intelligence. So this will be in 3 parts. We'll look at cognition first, language second, and then intelligence in the final video. So let's go ahead and move forward. By the end of this video, you should be able to define what thinking is, explain how thinking is used, and also in problem solving and decision making. So you're going to be thinking about thinking or engaging in some metacognition, and maybe thinking about the quality of your own thinking in terms of problem solving and decision making. We'll look at the nature of language, especially looking at how language develops. We'll talk about human language mostly for this chapter, but of course, humans aren't the only ones that use language to a certain degree. We just happen to be the ones who use it best. We'll look at some different theories in nature of intelligence. There are a few different competing theories, whether is a singular intelligence versus multiple intelligence. That's still sort of a big debate going on in psychology even today. We'll also look at the methods that are used for measuring intelligence, and of course, those are not free of controversy, and we'll talk about some of that as well. And finally, we'll discuss the role of nature and nurture in terms of our development of intelligence. So before we do that, my computer is going to freeze up for a sec. There we go. Sorry about that. I'd like us to review very briefly from chapter number 6 on memory. So if you'd like, I'll go ahead and state the question, then you can pause the video and maybe check your own comprehension. So the review question to start off is, what is elaboration? And can you give me an example? And why does it help to store information in long-term memory? So let's go ahead and pause the video, jot some ideas down, and then come back when you feel like you got something. Okay, welcome back. So the part about elaboration, so what is elaboration? Well, it's kind of diving deep into something, studying something beyond just merely looking at it. You're elaborating upon it. When we're trying to study information, there are sort of 2 different ways we can elaborate upon information. Maybe we can rehearse it over and over and over again. Like if it's a list of items, like vocabulary items or equations or whatever we're going to use on a test, we might memorize them, verbatim that way. Another way of doing that is elaborative rehearsal, where we try to make it a very meaningful connection. So instead of studying that list and just saying it over and over again, maybe you come up with a story about each part of the list, something kind of silly or something interesting that kind of keeps your attention. And again, when we perform elaboration rather than just kind of rote memorization, this strengthens the bonds to our long-term memory, and it gives us more connections, and it makes it easier to pull that information out of long-term memory, retrieve it to use for later. Okay, let's jump into chapter number 7. Here are some true-false questions. Go ahead and take a look at these. Pause the video if you'd like. Mark down the one you think are true. Mark down the one you think are false, and we'll come to them as we go along. And my computer froze yet again. Let's see. Does it bounce back? There it goes. All right. So this chapter is all about thinking. This chapter is really all about cognition, a fancy word for thinking. Thinking is, if we want to define it, it's how we mentally represent the world. It's our ability to reason, to make judgments, to make decisions in terms of the information that we have. We use it, and what we are paying attention to is kind of what we're thinking about, or what we're thinking about is kind of what we're paying attention to. I guess maybe it kind of works both ways. So all of the stuff we're going to talk about falls under this umbrella of cognition. And you can think of cognition as all the stuff that takes place between your ears. It's the stuff we really can't see taking place. Like behaviors we can see and count and measure, cognition a little trickier. It's how human beings or all organisms attempt to understand the world around them and even change the world. So we need to make an understanding of it, and then we can use that information to possibly change the world around us. I'm not saying it change the world in some grand master idea or plan, but just even changing your own world, your neighborhood, your household, your school, something like that, through your understanding, through your thinking. And we think in terms of, at least in terms of humans, we think in terms of concepts. A really simplified way of thinking about concepts is just thinking in terms of nouns. Like you could just think of concepts as nouns, but a more nuanced explanation would be these are categories, mental categories for how we group things together that are related. Obviously, we group things together that typically have common properties, and the labels that we use to kind of categorize these different things, these objects, nouns, relations, abstractions, things like that, are dependent upon our experience. They're shaped by they're shaped by our culture. They're shaped by time and place. We also organize things hierarchically, which I think we talked about a little bit on chapter 6 when we talked about how we form and store long-term memories. So I'm going to flip slides for just a sec, and this is what I mean by hierarchy. So we have, if we think about here's the concept of storing information. How do we store information? Well, we can see we can have it printed, we can store it on a flash drive, or maybe even a cloud storage, and if we're more kind of up to date in our technology. But that even breaks down even further. Printed matter breaks down to newspapers, textbook, novels, catalogs, recipe books, all kinds of things that we could add to this. And then, of course, newspapers break down local, national, college newspaper versus, high school newspaper, all kinds of categories that we break things into, all kinds of hierarchies. It just shows how quickly and how much how organized our thinking really is. And oftentimes we use prototypes or exemplars. These are sort of our best example of a particular concept. So, for example, whenever I think of dogs, my sort of prototypical dog oftentimes is like a Labrador, one of those, a chocolate or one of those yellow or chocolate labs. If I hear that word dog, that's kind of what comes to mind for that concept for me. And obviously that's shaped by my experiences. If I say the word dog to you, maybe you had a pug growing up, and so you think of pugs. That's sort of your prototype. You can have positive examples and non-examples as well, that sort of fit the category or doesn't fit the category. Okay, so let's think about thinking for a sec. Can you name the next two letters in this series? Next two letters in this series. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can do that. Okay, welcome back. The next two letters in the sequence should have been, if you solved the problem correctly, should be N here and T here. So how we solve this problem is these are the first letters of numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Next is 9. Next is 10. So N and T. So hold on to that thought. Keep that in mind. You're practicing some problem solving now, but we'll come back to that and think about it more later. Because problem solving is ultimately, I know we're going to talk about intelligence later on in the chapter, but essentially problem solving is how we measure intelligence, at least in the Western world, how we conceptualize and understand intelligence. Problem solving, and when I say problems, it could be a math problem like in your math class, that is a problem, but it also could be a problem of deciding, hey, what am I going to do once I finish here in college? What kind of job am I going to get? Or simple problems like, hey, what am I going to wear today? Or where am I going to go to lunch? We are encountered with problems on a daily basis, and how we think oftentimes and how we represent the world helps us solve those problems for better or worse. It really helps if we have a background in the problem we're trying to solve, because the more novel things are, the more difficult it is to solve a problem when we haven't developed that expertise. That makes a lot of sense. One way that we can solve problems is through the use of an algorithm. Whoops, sorry, my computer froze again. Sorry about that, folks. It tends to do that when I get going. An algorithm is a very specific sort of formula or procedure that can be used for solving a problem. And as long as you follow that formula right, you're going to get the right answer. And an example of this would be a recipe. If you're hungry and let's say you wanted to make lasagna, you opened up a recipe book and you looked at lasagna. As long as you have the right ingredients and you follow each step, you're going to get the right answer. That's going to solve the problem. Now, the problem with using an algorithm, though, is it can be kind of time consuming. If you go through every single step to make lasagna, if you ever made lasagna before, it's not quite as easy as spaghetti. As far as like pastas are concerned, there's a lot more moving parts, both literally and figuratively going on. So, this can be a lengthy task. So let's say you don't have a lot of time and yet you're still hungry for lasagna. Well, what can you do? Instead of an algorithm, you can use a heuristic. And a heuristic is kind of like a shortcut or a mental, like kind of a rule of thumb that you can use for figuring out how to solve a problem. Now, it's a lot faster than an algorithm, because you're not quite following all the steps. So in this case, maybe in a heuristic, if you're hungry for lasagna, instead of making it yourself, well, maybe you call mom and mom makes it for you, or you go to a restaurant and they make it for you. But let's say, again, it doesn't necessarily guarantee the right solution. Maybe what if you call that restaurant up and they make you some lasagna, you go to pick it up and it's not good. Maybe, you know, they just messed up the order and now you got to wait even longer to get the right order, and you end up wasting more time than you did if you just made it yourself. So again, heuristics, they are useful for problem solving, but they don't quite give us the they don't quite give us the correct solution 100% of the time, like an algorithm will. An example of shortcuts are kind of like analogies that we know when we use something from a previous problem to solve a new problem, we're kind of taking a mental shortcut. We're using heuristics. Okay, let's try another problem-solving question. What rule governs this list of numbers? We have 8, 5, 4, 9, 1, 7, 6, 3, 2, 0. What rule governs this list of numbers? If you don't mind, pause the video, see if you can figure out, is there some kind of rule dictating the order of the numbers? Because obviously it's not the numerical order. Pause the video and come back when you think you got it. Okay. Welcome back. You should have went, if you got it correct, you should have went with these numbers are arranged in alphabetical order. 8 starts with an E, 5 starts with an F, 4 also starts with an F, so we would go FI for 5, FO for 4, so 5 goes before 4, 9, N, 1 starts with an O, 7 and 6 both start with an S, but 7 starts with an SE, 6 starts with an SI, 3 and 2 both start with a T, so we go to the second letter, and finally 0 starts with a Z. So the rule that governs this list of numbers is the alphabetical order. Maybe if you thought about, if you kept the same analogy from the prior problem I asked you about, then this might have been easier to solve. If you didn't, it might have taken you a little bit longer, and that's okay too, but it's kind of showing you how sometimes we can use analogies from previous problems to solve current problems. Things that factor into whether we solve a problem or not. Having expertise. I mentioned this earlier, but experts tend to solve problems faster than novels. They can process more information. They can process information simultaneously, whereas a novice has to kind of process one thing at a time. So if you are an expert in a particular field and a problem comes across your table, it's going to be a lot easier than the guy or gal on the first day of their job who hasn't quite developed their expertise. Your mental set, kind of how you approach problems in the past, and that gets into things like whether you're optimistic about a problem versus kind of gloom and doom about it. The mindset matters a lot in terms of your expertise. If you're mentally excited, if you're pumped up, if you've done this before and you're excited, that's probably a good likelihood that you're going to solve this next problem successfully. And then sometimes we solve problems using insight, where the answer just kind of comes to us without seemingly knowing it. It kind of pops into our head, kind of like an aha moment. And there's a really cool example of that on figure 7.2 in our text. You see this mouse here named Bismarck, and Bismarck has to get to the food, but in order to do so, Bismarck has to find a way to get around this fence that's blocking his way. So, Bismarck goes up ladder A, kind of looks at the fence for a while, looks at the food, and realizes, hey, I can't get to the food because there's this fence in the way, so what do I do? Bismarck thinks about it, and the light bulb is sort of indicating this insight. What if I go back down the ladder and look on the other side, and I think I see a ladder popping up. There's those two things popping up. Maybe there's a ladder there too. And obviously Bismarck can go around and go to the other side. Some other factors that involve, sometimes it's good to let problems just kind of sit on problems, to let problems kind of incubate. Sorry, my computer froze yet again. And it's, again, if we sit on problems, sometimes that insight is more likely to come. That's why sometimes it's good to just literally sleep or sit on a problem. Like if you're really thinking about something a lot, or you're troubled with something, whether it's schoolwork or a social problem, emotional problem, anything like that. If sometimes when we just kind of think about it and get away from it for a moment and sit on it and let it incubate, things kind of develop on their own. The answer kind of will develop in the background as we think about other things. And also, one thing that kind of gets in our way of solving problems is functional fixedness. It's where we look at certain objects or items and thinking about them and only in terms of one function. So let's say you've got a new apartment. You're furnishing your new apartment, and maybe it's your first apartment, and you've got a picture you want to hang on the wall, but you realized, oh man, I don't have tools. I don't have a hammer to hang this up. I want to hang this picture up, but what do I do? And you might decide, well, I don't have tools, so I can't do that. No picture goes up. But instead, if you had got over the functional fixedness and thought about it a little bit differently, you could have realized, oh, well, maybe one of my shoes or some other harder object like a textbook, maybe I could use that instead to kind of hammer that tack in or the nail in or however you want to do it. Sometimes it's nice to kind of look at things a little bit differently to get some insight. Okay, first truth or fiction. Only humans can use insight to solve problems. What do you think? Pause the video. Okay, welcome back. You should have answered false because remember Bismarck from the previous example in figure 7.2. Bismarck used insight to solve the problem of getting food and did it quite well for being a rat and not being a human. We talked about heuristics. We talked already about heuristics. I want to talk about some specific examples of heuristics that you might have encountered. These are things that we do all the time and maybe don't think about, and they impact how we make decisions. So the first one is the representativeness heuristic. This is a fancy word for saying stereotypes. We have certain stereotypes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about people. It could be about events, places, things, anything. I know we often think about stereotypes in terms of people. We can apply that to different things. You know, we think about certain things, ideas, people, places using heuristics, using these shortcuts. And sometimes that works out just fine. Hey, you know, I know certain people who work in this department, you know, are you know, maybe they think or act this particular way. So when I meet with these people in my department or in a different department, I kind of act a little bit differently, you know, to kind of get along better. You know, there's ways that it works out for us. The negative consequences are the stereotypes that develop along the lines of like racial, ethnic, religious, gender, things like that. That's where it is kind of a consequence. There is a consequence. The availability heuristic, on the other hand, is when we kind of use, for better or worse, we use all of the available information we have to make a decision. So, for example, if you just read an article about how safe, you know, the Hyundai Santa Fe is. I don't own a Hyundai Santa Fe. I'm just making one up off the top of my head. But if you just read a recent safety report and it says these are great vehicles, and you're thinking about buying a car, you may use all of that available information that you have to go buy that car. Or, for example, if you're watching the news and you just saw a report about shark attacks in Hawaii, but you were just thinking about flying to Hawaii for vacation, and then you decide, well, I'm not going to now because I've heard about shark attacks on the news. And really, there's more information out there that suggests that's not even true or not likely to happen at all. Shark attacks are incredibly rare, so don't use this single piece of information to make your decision. We also have the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. It's kind of where we make our initial presumption, our initial assumptions serve as kind of an anchor for future decisions. And whenever we get new information, we can kind of modify our adjustments, but typically we're really close to that first estimate. And again, this is kind of getting into like first impressions and why first impressions matter so much. When I think about this anchoring and adjustment heuristic, I think about my own dad, who's a little bit old. He's obviously older than I am. And he uses the internet, but he's still kind of hesitant about the internet. For example, he doesn't feel comfortable sharing like his credit card and buying things over the internet. You know, he'd rather go somewhere and buy it himself or order it over the phone. And so he kind of has this anchoring heuristic of, well, I've heard stories about people getting, you know, their credit card information stolen, so I don't want to do that. And my dad is even though he might hear news stories about how safe we are to use our information, or even I tell him all the time, hey, I buy stuff on the internet, no problem. He barely deviates away from that first initial estimate of shopping on the internet is dangerous because you could get your information hacked. So, you know, we could probably come up with lots of other examples. And again, this is impacting his ability to make decisions for better or worse. You know, obviously it's not a huge bit. It doesn't affect it all that much, but I feel like it, you know, it probably could make things faster if you use the internet. But my dad's retired and I guess doesn't necessarily need the faster, you know, to save that much time. So, you know, it kind of works out for him either way. Okay, so comprehension check. I know we just already talked about this, but go ahead and what is the availability heuristic? Give me your own example. Give me a different example than the ones I provided. See if you can come up with your own. Okay, welcome back. You should have mentioned something about how we're using available information to make decisions, for sometimes right, sometimes wrong. Another example you could come up with is choosing to fly or choosing to drive somewhere instead of flying because you heard about a plane crash on the news. Because statistically speaking, plane crashes are much less likely to happen than car accidents, yet we're more likely to choose to drive a car instead. But we're kind of making the wrong decision, at least using the available information. Okay, other factors that influence decisions. Framing matters a lot. The way a problem is presented and worded can matter a lot. How also our confidence, again, kind of tying back to expertise. If we think we're an expert and we're really not, we might also be overconfident in our ability to solve a problem, which could obviously weaken our ability to solve that problem. So if you think you're an expert, double check to make sure you're an expert. Don't just be overconfident because you think you are. Check your assumptions at the door. Okay, so that's it for chapter 7, part 1. We're going to stop here on cognition, and when we come back, we're going to get into language. So we'll start with communication with non-humans. So let's stop here, and we'll pick back up on the next video. Thank you for tuning in.